This is the Nintendo Entertainment System NES Classic Edition, the brand new all-in-one retro console that plays 30 of the most popular 8-bit games of all time. It's coming out November 11th for $59.99 and includes games like Super Mario Bros. 3, Final Fantasy, Castlevania, Pac-Man, and even StarTropics. It's an impressive list that made me wonder, what's the best reviewed game on the NES Classic? To find the answer, I decided to turn to my Classic Magazine Review Archive, a comprehensive list of old-school game reviews found in dozens of magazines from the United States, Britain, and all around the world. It's an archive with tens of thousands of reviews from 1986 all the way up to 1996. I decided to average the reviews and score each game packaged in the NES Classic, and today we're going to count down the entire list from worst to best. The list kicks off with the original Donkey Kong, which was first released on the NES back in 1986. This was an era when most magazines wrote previews and tips, never offering critical analysis or review scores. As a result, the only magazine to review Donkey Kong was Nintendo Magazine System, which gave it a 45% in their very first issue. They said that it isn't a bad coin-op conversion, but the original itself is years old, and 4 screens of arcade action simply isn't enough to warrant the price tag. As it turns out, Nintendo Magazine System was also the only magazine to review Donkey Kong Jr. I think you'll find this a reoccurring theme as we make our way through the list. The magazine liked the original coin-op, but complained that 4 screens of action just isn't enough to give the players value for money. They gave it a 46%. Many consider StarTropics to be a genuine 8-bit classic, but critics weren't as sold back in 1991. While Nintendo Power gave the game a 4.5 out of 5, the critics at Electronic Gaming Monthly strongly disagreed, giving it a 4 out of 10. SushiX said, "At first I thought I was playing Zelda, then Dragon Warrior, then Crystallis, then Ultima Avatar. What amazes me the most about StarTropics is the lack of any originality whatsoever." With 5 reviews, StarTropics averages a score of 56%. Here's another title that divided gamers in the early 1990s. Electronic Gaming Monthly called Dr. Mario an annoyingly over-involved version of Tetris meets Columns that takes a different approach and comes up way short. Nintendo Magazine System was much more generous, giving the game an 88% and calling it one of the best puzzle games on the NES. With mixed scores, Dr. Mario averages out to 66%. Although Sir Arthur would eventually go on to big numbers with a pair of 16-bit Ghouls and Ghosts games, his initial outing wasn't as well received. GamePro noted that while the graphics may seem a little primitive, the playability and challenge of this game is just as tough as many current titles. Nintendo Magazine System warned that the response is dodgy, and gamers should leave this well alone. Disagree. Kid Icarus is yet another early-generation NES game with only 1 review. Nintendo Magazine System gave the game a 68%, calling it a cutesy platform game and complaining that a lot of the design and graphics feel dated. Keep in mind that this review was published in 1992, 5 years after Kid Icarus was released. Look, I never said this was going to be a perfect list. Despite getting multiple releases, Nintendo Power was one of the only magazines to bother reviewing Pac-Man on the NES. They gave it a 3.5 out of 5 and said that it was true to the arcade game. They weren't as thrilled about the challenge, but ultimately concluded that it was a solid port. I mean, it's Pac-Man. After the success of Castlevania, it didn't surprise anybody that Konami would rush out a sequel. What did surprise people were the review scores, which ranged from 55% all the way up to 85%. Warning to approach with caution. The Games Machine called Simon's Quest yet another arcade RPG. Nintendo Magazine System complained that the sequel isn't much more than an extended version of the original. The scores average out to a 70%. GRADIUS is not only one of the few shoot-'em-ups in the collection, but it's also one of the earliest shooters on the NES. The games machine called it a nostalgic shooter designed to bring a tear to many an arcade veteran's eyes. Nintendo Magazine System agreed, calling it great fun to play and ranks as one of the greatest blasts available on the Nintendo. GRADIUS averages a score of 73%. Speaking of Nintendo Magazine System, they were the only publication to review Balloon Fight. They confusingly explained that the aim of Balloon Fight is simplicity itself. Unfortunately, they also said that it grows dull very quickly. This joust-like scores a 74%. Next up is the original Castlevania, a game that Nintendo Magazine System largely enjoyed. The audio and visuals aren't stunning, but the action is absorbing for a long while. The games machine disagreed, noting that the graphics are among the best on the NES. They called the game spooky and loved the different backdrops. The reviews averaged to 76%. After falling in love with The Legend of Zelda, critics weren't as thrilled with the sequel. The games machine complained about the poorly designed graphics and change in gameplay, concluding that you should check out the genre first. Nintendo Magazine System was much more enthusiastic, giving the game a 94% and calling it one of the most enjoyable games on the system. Zelda 2 averages a very disappointing 79%. Given how much coverage magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly and Nintendo Power gave Ninja Gaiden, you might expect a flurry of reviews. This 1989 hit didn't get a proper release from most of the mainstream press. Instead, we get Game Informer tearing it down 5 years after release. Even with a strong review from Mean Machines, the original Ninja Gaiden only averaged a 79%. That's way too low in my opinion. Critics didn't have much to say about the original Metroid, at least not when it came to reviews. The 1987 action game scored only one review, and I'm pretty sure you already know what I'm about to say. Nintendo Magazine System called it intense, and said that it was a very cleverly put together arcade adventure with lots of unusual features that keep things interesting. They gave it an 80%. Final Fantasy is the first console role-playing game critics were genuinely excited for. While most of the mainstream magazines opted to cover the game without a review, those critics who wrote about Square's RPG seemed to love it. Both Nintendo Power and Video Games and Computer Entertainment called it revolutionary, gushing over the story and challenge. Final Fantasy averages an 80%. Yet another Contra game that's better on the NES than in the arcades. Super C was a big hit amongst critics in 1990. Electronic Gaming Monthly's 4 critics loved the fast-paced shooting and said that it improved on the original in every way. Nintendo Power agreed, giving it a 4.1 out of 5 and raving over the bosses and challenge. Super C averages an 80%. Now here's a twist you probably didn't see coming. With 5 critics weighing in, Double Dragon 2 was better reviewed than Final Fantasy, Ninja Gaiden, and even Metroid. EGM's Ed Samrad called it every bit as good, if not better than the first, and concluded that Double Dragon 2 is easily the best kick and punch game ever made. Nintendo Magazine System agreed, giving the game high marks and calling it the best Double Dragon game on the NES. While not as serious as Super C or Double Dragon 2, BOBBLE remains one of the Nintendo Entertainment System's best 2-player games. Raze seemed a little miffed that the console port was a little slower than the original, but recommended the game overall. Nintendo Magazine System loved the 100 meanie-filled platform levels, and concluded that it's a superb coin-op conversion. BOBBLE averages a respectable 82%. If you came here expecting a bunch of Mario Bros. Reviews, prepare to be disappointed. Much like Metroid and Balloon Fight, Nintendo Magazine System is the only publication to review this old-school arcade port. They said it was fun, but only truly worthwhile in 2-player mode. Nintendo Magazine System is also the only magazine to review EXCITEBIKE. Although their write-ups come years after release, I kinda like that they decided to go back and review a lot of the earlier releases. They gave EXCITEBIKE an 84% and said that it has a good feel of speed. I can't disagree with that, but 84% seems a bit high. If you're going to add a Mega Man game, you might as well go with the best. Mega Man 2 is not just a fan favorite, but it's also one of the best reviewed action games of 1989. EGM Sushi X didn't think Capcom would be able to top the original, but they did. The graphics are better than the first, it's longer, and there's even a password option. Computers and video games also loved Mega Man 2, calling it one of the best action games of all time and giving it a 95%. That averages out to an impressive 85% for Mega Man 2. The Legend of Zelda may be one of the most iconic games of all time, but you guessed it, only Nintendo Magazine System reviewed this gem. Giving it an 86%, the UK Mag gave it a strong recommendation, despite being one of the most expensive carts. The 5th best reviewed NES game is also one of the system's final games. Released in 1993, this 2D platformer found itself overshadowed by a cutthroat console war between the Sega Genesis and Super NES. Most critics were ready to go back to the 8-bit console, with GamePro giving Kirby's Adventure a perfect 5 out of 5 and Nintendo Magazine System scoring it a 93%. Both Electronic Gaming Monthly and CVG complained that the cart is too easy and should have been 16-bit, but they ultimately gave the platformer high marks. Between 8 critics, Kirby's Adventure scores a staggering 87%. The next game on the list is the original Super Mario Bros., one of the most influential games of all time. But instead of spending time quoting what the critics said, I'm going to just highlight this one very specific review. In 1988, the Games Machine published a fascinating take on Super Mario Bros. They got into the story, the dual language instruction manual, and much more. It's a lot more thorough than you'd expect from a game like this. Forget listening to me tell you about what Nintendo Magazine System said about yet another game. I suggest pausing the list and giving this thing a full read. I'm serious, just pause the video right here. I'll be here when you get done. Anyway, Super Mario Bros. Averaged a score of 92%. If you were going to ask me what the best game on the NES Classic is, I'd probably go with Super Mario Bros. 3. I think it's the perfect Mario game, even better than Super Mario World. Critics loved the game, but not enough to make it number 1. That said, it wasn't for the lack of trying. Both Nintendo Magazine System and CVG gave the ambitious sequel a near-perfect 98%. It's the long list of 9s from Electronic Gaming Monthly and GamePro that bring the average down to 92%. Having said that, pretty much every critic agreed that Super Mario Bros. 3 was a must-buy on day 1. Some will argue that the second best reviewed game on the list is only this high up because Nintendo Magazine System is the one publication to go back and review the Boxing Classic. Those people are right. What am I supposed to do? Punch-Out is one of Nintendo Magazine System's highest rated games, only topped by the likes of Zelda 3, Tetris, and Solar Jetman. It's times like these when I wish Electronic Gaming Monthly would have started just a few years earlier. Who would have guessed that the top reviewed NES game in the package would be Super Mario Bros. 2? Critics took the change in graphics and gameplay with stride, calling it one of the most playable and enjoyable platformers on the system. Computers and video games gave Super Mario Bros. 2 a near-perfect 97%, and called it simply brilliant. Nintendo Magazine System agreed, keeping the average up at 97%. Whether that score would have held if Electronic Gaming Monthly had gotten to it, we'll never know. No matter what you think of these reviews, I have to say that the NES Classic has a solid lineup of games. There are some fun surprises and a lot of well-known hits. It's great to see games like Ninja Gaiden and Super C pop up, even if the rest of their franchise was left on the cutting room floor. In case you're wondering, the average score is 76%. That's not too bad. Before I throw this video to the closing credits, I just want to note that the NES Classic has 3 games that received absolutely 0 reviews. Not even Nintendo Magazine System reviewed them. The 3 scoreless games are Ice Climbers, Galaga, and Tecmo Bowl. I'll let your nostalgia dictate where those games would fall on the list. Hey, thanks for watching our exhaustive look at the NES Classic. This does seem like a cool little device, but it also feels like Nintendo playing catch-up. Both Sega and Atari had similar retro consoles years ago, so why did it take Nintendo so long? Hopefully they get it right, because it's a genuinely cool list of games. If you're into 8-bit Nintendo, then I recommend you check out my Spirit Sphere preview. It's basically Zelda plus Windjammers. The game hits Steam in a couple of weeks, and we have an early look up right now. So do me a favor and click the subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.